We'll just look at a lot of maps today. I tried putting these into PowerPoint, but it's actually a lot faster to just link to them. So you'll be able to link to these. But what I'm looking at, there's a lot of really good maps. There's some at the library here at OSU that are very good. The Library of Congress has a larger collection, and it's a lot faster and easier to use. We'll look at some of these today. So let's move on to. We're gonna finish up with this one, chapter 4, and we're gonna go into 5. I don't know if we'll get through 5, but it's pretty complicated. The last time we were talking about chapter 4, westward expansion and reservations, and remember I said, sorry about that, said that this is kind of in my opinion, this chapter is spread a little too thin and could be several chapters. So there's a lot of overlap that's going to happen. That's just kind of a warning there. We've talked about all of this last time, and we ended up by talking about the 5 tribes. And I think I'll start off by having you look at, let's see, one of these maps is probably over here. Yeah, here we go. So let's look at this one. This is Indian Territory in, I believe it's 1866. Yeah. So in 1866, the territories of the 5 civilized tribes were altered. Maybe you can have a look at that. Can you see that? You'll be able to see it better online. So in 1866, after the Civil War, because the factions of the 5 civilized tribes had signed alliances, treaties of alliance with the Confederacy, after the war, the Union came back and said, okay, you all have to renegotiate all of your treaties. Basically, your treaties are basically abrogated because you broke your loyalty to the United States. And all 5 tribes had constitutions. Those constitutions were required to be rewritten, like the southern states' constitutions were required to be rewritten after the Civil War. Slavery, of course, was abolished in those new treaty, or those new, there were treaties of 1866, and then there are also new constitutions. So slavery was abolished in the treaties of 1866. Interestingly, the Proclamation of 1863. Anyway, forget it. I keep thinking of an Andy Griffith episode in which Andy Griffith asks Barney what was the proclamation. What was it that ended slavery? Help me out. Emancipation, thanks. OMD again. Emancipation Proclamation, and of course Barney said, "Oh, that's what the proclamation that amended." Anyway, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 did not really apply to Indian Territory, and Indian Territory was technically the last part of the United States to end slavery. In fact, General Stan Wade's detachment, which was part of the Southern Cherokee faction, was fighting in Arkansas, and they were the last group to lay down arms after the war. He was supposedly the last general to surrender. Anyway, here's a map of 1866, and this map shows the 5 tribes' areas in not as great a detail. I mean, you probably wouldn't notice it, but I mean, obviously the more significant locations are on the map, but you'll notice that the detail changes significantly in 1872 and after 1876. That's when the area was surveyed, the 5 tribes areas were surveyed. But at this point, what's happening are these boundaries are being created. This region would still be called the Cherokee Outlet, but it was not part of the Cherokee area proper. You can also see the Osage County area, and just to the west of that, still considered Cherokee land. That would change pretty quick. And then the Creek Country, Choctaw Nation, Chickasaw Nation, Seminole Nation is listed here. So if I never really thought of these as reservations in the true sense, but that's really not that really important at this point. So just to continue on, the United States abrogated previous treaty obligations, confiscated Western lands, and required new treaties that mention allotment of lands. I think I talked about that last time. In those treaties, in each of the 5 treaties, each of the five treaties of 1866, they just usually call them that. Then the land is defined boundary-wise, and then there's also this insertion of, at any time in the future when the nation would request it, the United States will, at its own expense, survey the land for individual allotments, something like that, individual parcels. Why did the 5 civilized tribes sign alliances with the Confederacy in the first place? Remember, it was just certain portions or certain factions of each tribe that did, and as you know, it was typically what we would probably call in an anthropology class or sociology class the more acculturated minorities within the tribes, particularly obviously the slave-owning minority within the tribes, who were typically occupying the best farmland and the best ranch land, and utilized their tribe's own system of land, what we would call land tenure, the ability to claim land. The individuals within the tribe, individual members within the tribe, could claim land mainly by establishing what are called improvements, and then their laws, at least the Cherokees' land tenure law, was that if you built a fence, or if you plowed a field, or if you had a cattle pasture, or if you built a house or an outbuilding, a barn, whatever, if you built that improvement, then you had the legal claim to 1/4 of a mile, or maybe it was 1/2 of a mile, in all directions of that improvement. So basically, you could build a ranch by building little improvements all over the place, and you claim this huge area. And that was possible because the populations were relatively small, and the populations of the acculturated groups that did that were much smaller, and they were in different locations than typically the more conservative groups. For example, in the Creek Nation, well, let's just look at a map, if you don't mind. I know it's kind of okay. Let's go back to that old Indian Territory map. And I'll zoom in just a little bit, if I may. In the Cherokee country, the vast majority of Union sympathizing, traditionalist, non-slave holding Cherokees under John Ross, the majority of them lived to the vast majority, almost entirely, lived to the east of what was referred to as the Grand River. Now it's like Grand Lake, all right? Grand Lake and Fort Gibson Lake and on down Robert S. Kerr Lake. So the old Grand River right here is basically the physiographic boundary of the Ozarks, the southwestern lobe of the Ozarks, which sticks into Oklahoma. And that's hilly terrain. It's hilly and forested, and it's very different environmentally from the vegetation and the terrain to the west, which is rolling to in areas fairly flat, but it doesn't have the timber that you have over here. And that's what the traditionalist Cherokees lived in the creek valleys, especially the tributary creek valleys to the Grand River and to the Illinois River. Here's the Illinois River. So the traditionalists typically lived here and lived in subsistence farm scale settlements. So individual family farms, usually strung out along creek valleys. On the other hand, the slaveholding, acculturated, Southern sympathizing Cherokees, who would typically claim large parcels of land in that fashion I told you about, they lived mostly in the lower part of the Grand Valley. They also lived, basically all throughout in the lower part of the Grand Valley, and also down here along the Canadian River and the along the Arkansas Valley. So these are all flatlands, really good alluvial farmland, and this is where most of the Southern sympathizing Cherokees were located, or at least they claimed land. So they were spatially separated quite a bit. Let's go to the Creek Country. In the Creek Country, the Creeks were divided between two groups during the Civil War. They were divided between the lower Creeks and the upper Creeks. During the Creek War, it was that those distinctions sort of emerged. The more acculturated groups were the lower Creeks, and the more traditionalist, non-conformist to the United States groups were referred to largely as the upper Creeks. And the upper-lower thing tended to refer to where they were on the rivers that flowed toward the Gulf. It's kind of difficult. You don't need to worry about that so much. But the upper Creeks were the traditionalists, Union sympathizing, and the acculturated Creeks were the descendants of the lower Creeks. They were slaveholders, all right, mostly. And the slaveholding upper or lower Creeks, more acculturated groups, tended to gravitate toward the more acculturated Cherokees. Okay, so they kind of lived in the same area, in the flat bottoms of the verdigris bottoms. This is Verdigris River. Some people say Verdigris, but Verdigris River, the Grand Valley, the Arkansas and the Canadian area. So, Southern Cherokees, Southern-oriented Creeks. The more traditionalist Creeks lived mostly down along the southern periphery of their lands, and were sort of interspersed along some of these other creeks. But they were separated mostly into different towns, so they were kind of spatially different too. Does anybody know? Okay, we'll move on quickly, or maybe not quickly. But does anybody know what's the most famous, infamous set of battles in Indian Territory during the Civil War? And I'll give you a hint. There's a landmark around here that's considered to be one of the locations of one of the battles, called the Battle of Round Mountain. There's actually 3 or 4 different locations that people believe were the Battle of Round Mountain, and probably the correct one is not the one out here near Yale, Oklahoma, out west of or east of us. But probably the best known set of skirmishes or battles between the Union-oriented tribal groups, and the Southern tribal groups was the breakout of Opothleyaholo. You heard of Opothleyaholo? Opothleyaholo was a leader of the Upper Creeks, a leader of the traditionalist Creeks, sided with the Union. There were, and of course he was able to gain some support from the Seminoles and of course a lot of there was actually an area. Okay, this is Creek Nation too. This is actually where a lot of the traditionalists were, down here. This area right here, south of this, which is the North Canadian, south side of the North Canadian, between the North Canadian and the Canadian River, right here, that was often referred to as the free black area because there were a lot of escaped slaves who had taken up residence down here and sort of protected themselves from, slave raiding. A lot of them sided with Opothleyaholo, and they realized that when the war started, they were in trouble. So they tried to get to Baxter Springs, Kansas. So they got a group of people, and they kind of gained population as they went, and they basically went straight north, or as straight north as they could, to Kansas. And on the way, the Southern Allied Cherokees and Creeks, but mostly Cherokees, attacked them, and attacked them about 3 or 4 times until the final attack, where they were just, they were largely decimated. Although the survivors got to Kansas eventually. Anyway, so that was part of that era. So the question is, why did the Southern sympathizing factions of the tribes, why did they sign treaties of alliance with the Confederacy, acting through General Albert Pike of the South? And this has to do with the course, all right? It's not a history course necessarily. It has to do with the course. Well, there are a lot of reasons probably. Of course, slavery was a big one. But there was also, in the treaties that the tribes signed with the Confederacy, the Confederacy had promised to allow representation in the Confederate Congress by the tribes. They were actually trying to incorporate them into their system of government. At least that was the promise. And that was, that was light years away from where they stood with the United States Congress, right? So they were tempted, or they were at least invited to join in the government of the Confederacy if it were successful. Okay, so that's probably like way too much discussion for one little point. But anyway, let's jump into the true reservation era, really after 1866, because most of the reservations that got established in the West came after the Civil War. A lot of the ones in Oklahoma, essentially all of them, well, except for maybe the northeast quarter, were established after 1866, and particularly after a few important dates. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, which I mentioned last time, and I did correct the dates since last time. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge, or Medicine Lodge Creek. Medicine Lodge Creek is an area up in southwest Kansas. I think it's near Dodge City, that area. So it was a location of where the United States met with factions of the Southern Cheyenne and the Kiowa, and I think the Arapaho, basically, and maybe the Comanche, but basically the Southern Plains tribes. And those Southern Plains tribes came together in 1867. There are a lot of photos of this negotiation, maybe not a lot. And what happened was the United States said, okay, well, we've reclaimed these lands in Indian Territory. We're going to establish reservations for each of y'all. So now you have your own reservation to be safe to live as long as the grass, or as long as the grass grows and the waters flow, right? Included the Cheyenne Reservation in western Oklahoma. Now that was largely without incident. Tribes started moving down to Indian Territory as they had promised in the treaty. Okay. Now, anybody ever been to Cheyenne, Oklahoma? I-40? Well, it's not just north of I-40. Cheyenne, Oklahoma. There is the Ouachita River flows right through the northern part of the town. And there is a national historic monument there. Okay? And it used to be called the Battle of the Ouachita. But now it's called the Ouachita Massacre Site. Okay? Anybody know anything about the history of that? George Armstrong Custer and a regiment of mostly volunteers, militiamen, or at least he was assisted with some, rode into a Cheyenne camp in the wintertime. It was a Cheyenne camp mostly made up of women and children and a few older men. And Custer was, on his political, his road to the White House, essentially, what he thought. And what had happened was there were some, what they refer to as renegade Cheyenne, and they believed that these Cheyenne who were wanted for murder were being harbored by this village on the Ouachita River in 1868, right after the reservation was established, right after the Southern Cheyenne had relocated to the reservation. So they were camping out on the Ouachita River. And Custer and his men, in a surprise attack at dawn, came in and cut down, I don't know what the total death toll was, but it was bad. And they didn't find any warriors to speak of. They didn't find the people who supposedly were there. But you know how that goes. It was washed over in the press as a victory, and only later did the truth really come out. Little Big Man. It's that whole scene is recreated in Little Big Man. It's pretty awful. The Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. Okay, well, there was an earlier Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851, and that was a very different treaty. It was more of a treaty to allow crossing of the plains with the Sioux. So it was a treaty with the Sioux, Lakota, various Lakota bands, to allow to allow American wagon trains to pass through the Central Plains, Northern Plains, in order to get to California in 1851. But at that same time, the Oregon Trail had actually been going on already. So the Oregon Trail and the California Gold Rush. So that was an initial treaty. And so the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne and others who were allied with the Lakota in the Central and Northern Plains were invited to negotiate a treaty at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, right? Which at the time I think was Nebraska territory, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was the one that established what would be referred to as the Great Sioux Reservation. So let me show you that we'll come back to this slide. Show you that on a map. I've got a national reservation set here somewhere. And this may not be the best one. Actually, we'll open up another one. Yeah. Yeah, this is a better one right here. Well, the Great Sioux Reservation's gone by this date. This is 1897 or 1892. Well, let me find. I think it's there. Thought I had one. I'll just go with this one. 1897, the reservations had already been taken, but the Great Sioux Reservation originally included all of these reservations that you probably recognize today, like the Rosebud and the Pine Ridge, Cheyenne River, Standing Rock Sioux, and Lower Brule Reservation. Those included the Black Hills. The Black Hills are located right here, right, western South Dakota, and basically what happened here was the 1868 treaty established that reservation and others out here in the northern plains. By this time, of course, you've got the southern Cheyenne down here in western Oklahoma, and the Wichita and the Caddo and the Kiowa Comanche, Kiowa Apache. So this is 1897, and how did the Great Sioux Reservation get broken up? Well, basically because of what was taking place during the Indian Wars. You ever notice that the United States rarely ever refers to any warlike relations with Indian tribes? It refers to that as war, except what's referred to in the history books as the Indian Wars, and that's mostly beginning in 1868 to the mid-1870s, something like that. Nobody's really sure. Maybe historians could point to a better date than I can, but the Indian Wars in the northern plains particularly brought about a military presence, and I've talked about that. There are lots of forts established in western Oklahoma. The Transcontinental Railroad, of course, crossed through 1869. That had something to do with it. The killing of the bison accelerates with the transcontinental railroads and other railroad construction. The buffalo hunters were also assigned out, and there was the United States set a price on buffalo robes, so artificially inflated the price so that they would be, or they were killed out. The Pawnee, but the record that we have is the last bison hunt of the Pawnee, who are still located up in the central plains of Nebraska, went on their last official buffalo hunt. Not an official, it's like signed forms and that sort of thing. No, they went on their buffalo hunt of 1874 and they didn't return. They never found any bison. They never found any. So the bison herds were cut in half by the Transcontinental Railroad, and then they were hunted to oblivion. In 1876, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. And that year, I think it was 76, it could be 74, but doesn't matter. Custer is the one, the individual who sort of took the credit for discovering the gold and opening up the Black Hills, because that was a widely popular thing that he did. Well, the Black Hills were within the Great Sioux Reservation, all right? And at the time, the United States was at war with the Lakota, the Sioux. And essentially that situation allowed the United States to do something that it hadn't done very frequently, if at all, and that is to declare declare a taking of land by force from an Indian tribe. In other words, remember the two ways of acquiring Indian land: purchase or by force during just wars, or by conquest during just wars. Here we have just war and a conquest. But this would later be contested, that the taking would later be contested in the courts. And we'll see more about that later on. I didn't talk about Grant's peace policy. Ulysses S. Grant, of course, was president after Civil War, and if you know much about Grant, he was, and I'll talk a little bit more about the peace policy in the next, in a couple more chapters, when we get to plenary power number 1. But Grant was a Quaker. He was from Ohio. He was he came from, I guess you could say, Quaker roots, because he wasn't much of a pacifist during the Civil War. But he came from that, sort of that background where he wanted peace. He wanted the United States to expand in the most peaceful way he could. He had, respected the tribes, but he wanted the best for the tribes, I think we can honestly say. And Ulysses S. Grant wrote one of the most readable and, open autobiographies that you'll ever find. And anyway, I think there's lots of evidence that Ulysses S. Grant wanted the best for the Indian tribes. Okay, and a lot of that had to do with his very close confidant, Eli S. Parker. Eli S. Parker, who was not only Grant's right-hand man during most of the Civil War, most of the time that he was in charge of the Union forces, but after the war, he made Parker Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Now, you know anything about Eli S. Parker? Okay, we'll hold that thought. So what Grant did, and Eli S. Parker, I'll say right now, was a Baptist. He was a Baptist. His father was a Baptist preacher, in fact. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for now. What he did was he put Parker in charge, and Parker, informed Grant that the best thing we could do. The problem was in the late 1860s was that the Indian Service, as we know the Indian Service, those are the Indian agents and also the bureaucrats in places, the larger cities, and then in the bureau, the Indian office in Washington, D.C. in the Department of the Interior. Well, most of the field agents throughout the Indian country in the West were the remnants of those people who were called back for service during the Civil War. In other words, they were the people nobody wanted, and they were happy to be, military people typically want to go to the fight, right? These are the people who didn't mind staying out away from the fight, and they're in the military. A lot of them were political appointees. So they were, incredibly corrupt by the mid to late 1860s. And if you look at United States Indian history during the Civil War in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota, the Minnesota Sioux Roundup, where there were some murders, and they rounded up 157 Sioux, and we're going to hang all of them, but they commuted sentences on some of them. But it was the largest mass execution by the United States federal government in its history occurred in Minnesota, or maybe hanging Sioux captives or Sioux prisoners. Well, officially, okay. There was also the Civil War. But anyway, you have this attempt to eliminate the corruption in the Indian Service. And the only way they knew they could do that was by getting rid of the military people in the Indian Service and replacing them with other people. Parker said, replace them with religious organizations who can kind of self-regulate and you can probably trust not to be totally corrupt. Okay, so what they did was they invited the various religious groups, particularly those that had been working with tribes already, and said, they wanted them to take over the jobs in the Indian offices and the Indian agencies. And that's what happened. Sometimes whole denominations received purview or received administration over entire tribes, groups of tribes. I know, has anybody ever noticed anything, sort of the results of that? The Quakers, for example, were given the Osage tribe, the Osage Nation. And today you can go to like Pawhuska and see a Friends, whatever they call it, church. The Roman Catholic Church also got involved with the Osage. So you see Roman Catholic. That may have something to do with the French way back when, though. I'm not sure about that. So Elias Parker, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, is really the person who placed the tribes in the Indian office into the hands of religious groups. Now, what happened there was when the religious organizations took their place in the Indian service, they changed a lot of the policies, or at least they created new policies. Remember the different ways you can get federal Indian law created? Constitution, treaties, federal statutes passed by Congress. What's another one? Executive order. What's another one? What's the sneaky one that I've told you about? The ones that is probably the most dangerous form of Indian policy. Administrative rules. Those are the policies that are established within bureaucracies, within the Indian office. So essentially, it's kind of like an executive order, but an executive order is, that's the president saying, we need to do this now, which, that gets all the press. But when, a middle-level bureaucrat says, well, we probably ought to do this, and they, the bureaucracy, the federal agency or whatever, creates a new rule that can affect the lives of many, many people. It has to be revealed in the congressional record, but that's it. It's not subject to any sort of oversight by by another branch of the government. It's basically within the executive branch, and it's not even known very much. So this is where a lot of the really awful things begin. Within the Indian office, you begin, you will read about, if you haven't already, the Indian courts. And I'm not talking about the courts of the tribes, but I'm talking about the sort of a federal administrative system of rules and punishments. Okay, and so you'll read about that. So it's ironic, but the primary thing I want you to get from this is that when Grant turns over the Indian office to religious groups, he does get rid of the corruption that was there with the military people. All right. And he replaces that with people who are there to change Indian cultures. And they're pretty good at it. Okay? You remember that movie way back when, Dances with Wolves? Kevin Costner. It was like 1991 or 2 or something like that. There's a scene where Kevin Costner is trying to get out to this fort, and he goes to the local Indian agent. Remember that? You remember that? You see that?
It's not a long time ago.
Okay. And remember that the Indian agent is drunk? And he says, I just pissed my pants. And the guy, and it's like Kevin Costner saying, this guy's, he's a mess. He leaves, and then you hear a gunshot, and he blew his brains out. So it's a
Oh yeah, he's like losing his mind.
yeah. He was one of he's a good example, or at least in my image of one of these corrupt Indian agents that was out in the boondocks, and anyway, that's the corruption side, right?
He just seemed like he was pretty scared, like he didn't know what he was doing.
Yeah. Okay. Last part of your chapter here is the Cherokee Tobacco case. It's just Cherokee Tobacco, but it doesn't really give you an idea that it was a Supreme Court case. There was a treaty with the Treaty of 1866, the new treaties of 1866. The federal government actually made a lot of promises of, autonomy to the tribes, the 5 tribes. In the case of the Cherokees are always making trouble, right? They're always kind of testing the water and pushing the envelope. You can read about the details, but basically the Cherokee Nation was not supposed to be taxed in terms of its commerce. The assumption was they wouldn't have to pay any taxes on things like commerce, on selling cattle or importing things, whatever. Alcohol is not included in this, but because alcohol is prohibited in Indian country, would be for a long time. So in the case of the tobacco case, though, it dealt with a federal tax on tobacco, and of course the federal government has long taxed for tobacco. It's a major moneymaker, right? So the Cherokee case was basically the Cherokees were protesting the implementation of a federal tax on tobacco commerce. The details are in your text. But what the ruling brought about was, again, here's an example, and you're going to see many more of these throughout the course. It's an example of a tribe trying to do something, and it runs into a problem, and they attempt to get this fixed in the courts. And what it does is it brings about a much more significant question, all right? And that is, the treaty said that the tribe would not be taxed on certain, whatever it was. But here Congress says, no, we're going to apply the tobacco tax on you. So it was basically a broken treaty. The 1866 treaty was broken by that tax. And it resulted in the question of whether or not an Indian treaty, as written, can be changed or abrogated by Congress. And the answer, according to the Supreme Court, was, well, yeah, because Congress has plenary power over the Indian tribes. That means any Indian treaty, beginning in 1866 with the Cherokee Tobacco case, any Indian treaty, well, it wasn't 1866, it was later. Any Indian treaty may be altered or abrogated at any time, according to if Congress wants to do that. And in this particular case, Indian tribes are not exempt from federal taxation. Emphasis on federal. Okay? So the federal government can tax tribes, but they're still exempt from state taxation. There aren't a lot of federal taxes, really, right? There are some on alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and stuff like that. But, philosophically, this was awful because, the United States broke away from Great Britain largely because of this problem of being taxed but not having any representation. And tribes didn't have any representation, of course. They were written out of the Constitution. So, you can read about that in Justia if you want. It's not going to have a recording, unfortunately. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 5. Any questions over that? Okay, we probably spent too much time on that, but we'll move on. Now let's look at allotment. This is a fairly complex chapter, or at least my presentation is going to have a lot more detail than the reading, okay? So be sure you get this info because it's not provided that well in the reading. And we'll look at some maps also. We'll probably continue this on Thursday. Well, most certainly we will, okay? That's okay. Now, again, I kind of take issue with the chronological divisions here in the book. Your author he has a lot of credentials, and I don't want to say anything bad about that, but he's a lawyer and a very good legal scholar. However, I'm not. But I was trained a lot in history, all right, mostly history. Probably more history than geography. Don't tell anybody. But essentially, I have issues with the chronology because there is this period that you might want to call sort of the acculturation, forced acculturation period that really begins with reservations and and it continues on until 1934. So this is a very broad definition of what we might. He calls it allotment. I think you should probably call it forced assimilation. It's really broad, and he starts the allotment period in 1871 for legal reasons. Okay, yeah, it makes sense. But like I said, if you really want to take the allotment situation, allotment issue to its roots, I already said, remember that the treaties of 1866 mentioned allotment, like everybody knew what that was. But even then is not really the earliest. There was a historian by the name of Annie Heloise Abel. You ever heard of her? Annie Heloise Abel. She wrote a trilogy, 3-volume set of books about. It had a great title. It's called. What's it called? You couldn't call it this now. Redskins, Ruffle Shirts, and Rednecks. It was written back in the, 30s or 40s. It was really old. But it was one of the early Indian histories. And it dealt with the pre-removal era and the post-removal era, Mississippi, and a few other, Mississippi and Alabama, I think, primarily. And if you look at what Annie Heloise Abel found, there were actually allotments made to wealthy Choctaws and Chickasaws and probably Creeks in Alabama, in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi back in the removal era. So the idea there was the negotiators were trying to bribe the signatories of the treaties by handing them these big plantations, giving them land allotment. So that term allotment was used way back then in the 1800s, early 1800s. But nevertheless, 1871 is what your textbook author points to as the beginning of allotment, and that's because in 1871, a real significant year for American Indian law and Indian policy. Anybody know what it was? 1871 was the year that the Congress, the United States Congress, due to many reasons, sort of casually declared that there would be no more Indian treaties. That's the year that treaty making ended. All right. It's the year that treaty making ended. Some historians will say that the reason that was passed was because there was a rivalry between the Senate and the House of Representatives, and that rivalry had to do with revenue and allocating revenue. So the Senate basically, the House of Representatives is in charge of of appropriations. Okay, so if you want power, you want to be on one of the many appropriations committees in the House of Representatives. The Senate, on the other hand, the Senate is the one that typically spends the money. The Senate, at least at this point in U.S. history, the Senate had been spending lots of money on things like international affairs and that sort of thing that the House members representing the people a little more directly were not wanting to fund. And they didn't want to, they did not want to supply money for the things that the Senate was doing. Now, the Senate, of course, is in charge of treaties, at least international negotiations, that sort of thing. So it was kind of a power play, supposedly. So what Congress did was say, well, there won't be any more Indian treaties because, anyway. So that's what happened. It was not so much an outward attempt to say we're no longer in need of writing Indian treaties because we've conquered all the native peoples. It's not really so much that, although it was maybe a little bit. But by 1871, it was pretty clear that Congress had plenary power over Indian affairs, and it really didn't need to treat tribes as equals, okay? And so you wouldn't have any more Indian treaties. Now that changed some things. It's significant. It changed some things. There would still be reservations created, and those reservations had to be negotiated. There were still cessions to be taken. There were still lands that were ceded. So how do you cede land without a treaty? Well, they still had an instrument that was basically called a formal agreement. And I think maybe that's one of those on the list of ways that Indian policy is created. Basically, formal agreements took over where treaties left off. But there's one difference. We should make this point, and it'll be brought up again. The difference between an Indian treaty and a formal agreement between Congress and an Indian tribe is this. In an Indian treaty, there are two sides that are negotiating the treaty, and they both agree to it at some date. And that treaty then is ratified by Congress. Okay? The Indian treaty, after the Cherokee Tobacco case, however, Cherokee Tobacco found that if Congress wants to, it can change, it can break a treaty legally. All right? And it doesn't sound really good, but they can do it if they want. In the case of an agreement, the Indian tribe and the government will negotiate an agreement. Then that agreement goes to Congress and goes to a committee. And in the committee, the agreement can be changed and then passed. So that largely is a problem for the tribe. If the tribe negotiates one thing and signs off on it, that agreement can be changed after the fact. They can't do anything about that. So agreements are not treaties, and they're not equal. All right? All right. So 1871, in many ways, is kind of a forced way to, the Indian policies are now going to be driven by the United States, and not as the Indian tribes are not going to be treated as if they are sovereign governments. They're not going to be treated as if it's a government-to-government relationship, and that would continue on. After 1871, it would come to some sort of conclusion in 1934, but then you would have another period in the 50s before you have sort of a reclaiming of autonomy through a policy called self-determination. Okay? All right. Sorry. The General Allotment Act, 1887, is one of the most important, significant statutes affecting Indian policy ever. The General Allotment Act, 1887. It has consequences on par with the Marshall Trilogy. Not so much philosophically as much as in actuality, reality. Okay? It changed the way things are for Indian tribes. Now, who is Dawes? Henry L. Dawes was a Massachusetts senator. He was very well respected. He was, considered himself to be a humanitarian, looking out for the Indian tribes. And I've really kind of given you a little too much here, but the idea of allotment is, 1887 for 25 years, up to 1887, for 25 years, the United States has had a policy known as the Homestead Policy. The Homestead Act began in 1862, and the expansion of the United States agricultural frontier into the Great Plains and even into the Mountain West greatly spread non-Indian settlement into Indian country, or into what was Indian country. It really set off these huge agricultural surpluses were brought into the cities by rail connections, and you begin to see real industrialization at this point in the late 1860s, 1870s. Well, it was a time when the economy was booming in the United States. It was also a time of great immigration from overseas. It was the sort of the high point of what are referred to as the old immigrants, the Germans and the Irish and the British and the Scandinavians who were coming into the United States, into the interior of the United States especially. So, in a sense, allotment was an idea to extend the homestead policy to Indian tribes. That it was clear to those who saw it that there was a problem with reservations, and that problem, number one problem with reservations, and the poverty and destitution of Indian reservations to the outside Anglo-American eye was a lack of personal property, a lack of real estate, a lack of individual landholding. That was considered the reason why Indian people never had many Indian people had not acculturated into American life. Okay? So if you think about this, I think you'll find that there's some logic to that. Number one, if you don't have individual landholding, you're subject to what I talk a lot about in my conservation class called the tragedy of the commons. Nobody owns it, or if everybody owns it, nobody owns it, and nobody's responsible for it, nobody has the incentive to care for it, whatever. In an Indian reservation where nobody could actually own the land, what's the incentive to use land for personal gain, the development of personal gain? To build, you can't build a farm if you don't have any cash, and you can't have any cash if you don't, if you're not rich. But how could the farmers in the Great Plains or the settlers who came to the unassigned lands in 1889, like my great-great-grandpa Walter from Indiana, he came into, y'all know where 6th and Country Club is? There's a big on-cue station there, and there's a subdivision behind it. That quarter section is where my grandpa homesteaded. He came in hopefully April 22nd, 1889. But he filed on that after 5 years and got a patent to it from the government. And then he went down to the bank, probably Stillwater National Bank, and he mortgaged it. Why did he do that? He took the money that he could get from putting that land up for collateral, And by taking that cash, he could build what he needed to on his farm. He had the land, but he didn't have any cash. And he had 6 kids. So that cash allowed him to build a house, build a barn, fence the place, buy cattle, buy, horses and seed crops and that sort of thing. So without individual land ownership, you're dependent on whatever anybody will give you. There's no financial basis to development. So, for the people wondering why don't these reservation Indians just farm? Well, hell, they don't have any money. They didn't have any money. Not only that, they were far flung from markets, from agricultural markets. They didn't have any transportation. Only a fool would ask why they didn't farm, okay? In fact, the Indian men on reservations would often work really hard in order to be selected by the Indian agent to be what they called a freighter, basically to take wagon loads of supplies back and forth from railroad depots, railroad stations. Sometimes that was 100 miles or more of moving goods by wagon. So that was a very, very sought after job. You'd actually make some money that way. All right. So anyway, the idea was the intellectuals in New England and the Northeast, the people who were against removal, the people who were against slavery, realized that, okay, if we're going to incorporate this, if this population is not going to die off, and there was this myth, there was very much a popular belief that the Indian populations were dying out like the buffalo were dying out, that they would die out and be gone forever. And so in order to stop that, Northeastern humanitarians believed that individual Indian people should be given their own land, just like Americans who wanted farms got them free. They should be able to have their own land. So those are the presumptuous do-gooders, all right? And, maybe presumptuous, maybe they just weren't able to see the future real well. They did know that these Northeastern presumptuous do-gooders, they did think that if, there needed to be a kind of a learning curve for Native peoples to assimilate. So they realized that these were people that didn't use cash money, they didn't deal with banks typically. 5 tribes did, but they realized that there had to be maybe a longer period of allowing the tribal member to acclimate to the American financial system and economic system. So what they did was they said, okay, just to make sure that the sneaky non-Indians among us don't rip them off by buying land for nothing, we're going to have something called a restricted period, and that's going to be about 25 years. So a 25-year period of holding a title by the federal government, a 25-year trust period in which the federal government would assign an allotment to an individual. That individual, after 25 years, could receive a fee title to the land. Now, if you're like my age, and especially my age in like 1892, I'm on my last leg. I don't have 25 years left. I might have 5 years left. So that's kind of a problem, right? I mean, if you're born in, if you're only 10 years old when the allotment comes, well, you're in probably good shape. You're going to get an allotment. And you're probably going to get your mom and dad's allotment, maybe. Okay. Anyway, the idea was to prevent individual allottees. We're going to say that a lot. To prevent individual allottees from losing their land to fraud there would be a 25-year period called a restricted period in which the land could not move from, it could not change hands. It could not be sold. Okay? And the only way that could happen was by not giving a title to the Indian occupant, the allotee. So the United States would hold the title, basically wouldn't even designate that land, wouldn't take it out of the public domain. It would just go into Indian trust, like a reservation, sort of like an individual reservation. And then after 25 years, that would be, it would deliver a patent, and then they could do whatever they wanted to after then. Okay, so that's the Northeast. The Western settlers, we only have a minute left. What do you suppose the non-academics, the people that lived out in Kansas, were thinking about when the allotment idea started being thrown around?
They wanted to be able to buy the land after it was allotted.
They wanted to be able to buy land, yeah. So they were for the breaking up the reservations, because they knew that would open up not just the lands that the tribal members could sell after 25 years, but when you've got, maybe you have a reservation, let's say of 1 million acres, which is maybe the equivalent of a couple of counties around here. So you got a 1 million acre reservation, and you've got a population of native people on the reservation of, let's say, 1,500, which is pretty realistic back then. If you do the math, how many acres would that 1,500 people, 1,500 times 160 acres, 160 acres is 1/4 section. So if you do 160 times 1,500, how many acres is that? And it's over time. So anyway, you can think about that.